I can't hear you, Adam. How about now?
There we go.
There you go. Good afternoon. Welcome to Crew Classé at Home, Volume 5. For those of you that don't know, my name is Adam Halpern. My family, Halpern Enterprises, started in the 1950s, and we are one of the oldest wine importers of fine wine in Canada. And I am proudly the third generation involved. Virtual community is something that is quite integral nowadays, especially given the circumstances around the world. My team believed this was imperative to begin. I know many people in the industry are doing things that are similar. I've watched many of them. They're all very good. So I'm very appreciative to learn so many new things in such a small period of time, whether that's, Renzo in Italy, Antonio in New York, or whomever it is. It's really an unbelievable accomplishment that we've seen that tech transcends all borders around the world. First and foremost, we hope everyone is safe and healthy. From everyone here and the Halpern team, we appreciate you tuning in from wherever you are around the world. We send our love and our hope, and I'm looking forward to having a glass of wine with everyone when we come out of this. I'd first like to introduce my colleague, Sheila Flaherty. She is our brand manager for Antenori here in Ontario. Hey, Sheila.
Hi. I can't believe we're already on number 5.
I know, whizzing by.
Yeah. So I'll just jump in. I just want to introduce our two very, very, very special guests today. Antonio Galloni, thank you so much for joining us again. Antonio is the founder of both Vinous Media and Delectable, which are two, an app and a website that we use a ton in our business. Vinous is definitely one of the leading sites for reviews, and it helps us. I can't recommend it enough. There is a discount code for 30% off if you use Antinori for the subscription. So thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
And Renzo Cotarella, thank you so much for joining us from Orvieto in Umbria. Renzo is the CEO and chief winemaker for Antenori, and we are very honored to have you on today.
It is my pleasure.
Just want to jump at how Antonio and Renzo, how did you know each other quite well, correct?
Well, I'm lucky to know quite a few people because I spend a lot of time traveling and tasting wine, and I usually taste Renzo's wines twice a year because I taste them at least twice a year in Italy, because now I taste them, the Chianti Classico wines at Tignanello, and then the Maremma wines at Guado al Tasso. But just, Sheila, I just want to say, because I don't want to take credit for something I didn't do, I did help found Vinous, but Delectable we purchased, and some other very smart people founded it. So I don't want to take credit for that. But anyway, Renzo and I taste
more
expensive. Huh?
More expensive.
Yeah. Renzo and I taste in Italy twice a year, and at least, and then sometimes in the United States. Last year we did a big vertical of Solaia in London. So I don't really know how we met exactly, but like a lot of people in wine, I feel like I've known Renzo basically my entire life. So
I was thinking, we were talking about it this morning, and I think the first time we met Renzo was 5 years ago. You were here for our Grand Cru Culinary Festival and did, Adam, you might remember, but I believe it was about a 10 or 15 year vertical of Solaia, which was definitely one of the most amazing. Antonio, you were here for that as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that was a fascinating tasting. So I think that was the first time I met.
Yeah.
Where nice wines are, Antonio's there.
Right.
Well, I'm assuming many people tuning in today are familiar with the Antenori family. Definitely one of the most iconic producers in the world, and definitely one of the most storied as well. So they date back over 600 years and are one of the oldest family-run companies in the world. But maybe, Renzo, I'll let you jump in and maybe just a little bit of the history on Antenori for those that aren't familiar.
No, as you say, I mean, the company is a family-owned company that started producing wine in 1385, so 26 generation. And in each generation, at least one member of the family was involved in the wine business. This is really the peculiarity of the family, because maybe you can have the company for many, many years, but sometimes you can you give the management to the managers. In our case, one member of the family always, in each generation, was really involved in managing the business. So that is really something unique, I think, in the wine world, in the wine business. And year after year, generation after generation, for sure, let's say, the idea, the culture of the wine really went into the blood of the family, and I think this is really something unique. I mean, I feel myself very lucky to stay with this company, to start at 40 years ago, and I'm still here with the same passion, because it's the passion that has the family, and the idea of improving the quality, in experimenting new things, in seeing new places in the world has been always in the blood of Antinori, and that is really unique.
I mean, that's pretty incredible to vintage after vintage for that, the level of quality and the integrity to keep being passed down for 26 generations. I mean, there's so many family businesses that, you know, at some point would have a break within there. So.
No, you know, it is really a great responsibility to manage a company like Antinori, and for Piero, and now with the 3 daughters, it's really, I mean, an incredible responsibility, very heavy responsibility, with the idea of they are just there for a generation. Then they have to pass the company with the value, the real value of the company, to the next one. So it's just a passage. And once you pass your, let's say, your blow, your hair, to your family, to your children, you do as much as you can. You want to pass all the, let's say, wonderful things. And wine is something unique, I must say, really unique. So I think, as I said before, we are very lucky to work with, not for, a company like Antinori, but with a family like Antinori. We are very lucky because we have an old history to represent, an old culture to represent. But having said that, we cannot see our tradition as a destiny. Our destiny is, of course, tradition is important because it's something that is part of your life, is part of your experience. But without, let's say, innovation, it's completely useless. And so what is really make Antinori different, in my opinion, is this one. Having a strong tradition that never stopped our ability to think about the future.
And Renzo, before we jump into the unbelievable wines you guys make, the styles, the other pieces of your history in the land, quickly, I wanted to ask you, what's your history? So you've been with the company for so long, and then I guess 2-part, what influenced you to become a winemaker?
You know, my family has been always involved in the wine business, even if it was so involved that I didn't want to be involved. And so this is the reason why when I was young, I decided to study chemistry. But then something happened in my family. I lost my father, and it was so happy for me to do something in the agriculture that I decided to go to the University of Agriculture, where I was graduated in the beginning of 78 as, let's say, agricultural engineer with a specialization on viticulture. But I was not really a winemaker, even if my brother is a winemaker and has been always just influenced by making wine. But for sure, I was obliged, in a certain sense, to study winemaking and to be more involved in winemaking, because I realized that you cannot produce grapes without knowing how to manage the grapes and what is the final result of your grapes. So you must cover all the, let's say, the circle, from grapes to wine, if you want to really succeed. If you want to produce grapes properly, in order to produce that wine, not the other one. So I was obliged, in a certain sense. I felt obliged to do this, and I'm really very happy I did this.
You were born and raised in Umbria, correct?
Yes.
And
yes.
You still live there? And you still live there, correct?
I still live here. My family lives here, even if I spend practically my week in Florence or around the estates. But I mean, I never moved my family to Florence. I don't know why. Probably at the beginning, when I moved to Florence in 91, 92, 93, I thought that, I mean, that was just for a small period of time, because I wanted to come here. Here I'm in Orvieto. I have my roots, and the Castello della Sala, the estate where I started working, has been always my heart, and I didn't want to lose it. So, I mean, even if I started working in the other estate, I felt Castello della Sala as my estate, and the idea was to come back. But I mean, then it didn't happen. But in any case, I came back every weekend, and every weekend I spent some hours at Castello della Sala in any case.
It's a pretty magical spot.
It's unique, but for me, it's something, maybe I'm not really the right person to talk about this, about Castello della Sala. I'm really in love with the place since I was a young boy. I used to pass just in front of Castello della Sala from the castle with my father, going to take a bus to go to Perugia to study. And, a castle for a young boy has been always something mystic, something unique. And the first day I entered there, that was April 79. So practically 41 years ago now, it was really a great emotion for me. I cannot forget. So I remain really close to that place. And also Castello della Sala is the place that allowed me to do what I'm doing now. Because I started there producing white wine, trying to really experiment new things. And I learned a lot, especially from the people there, from the workers. I have to recognize I was very young when I was there, and I didn't have the experience, but I was able really to acquire experience from the simple worker, people that used to prune or used to work in the vineyard. They were fantastic. They're all, I used to call them contadini. They were a category that used to manage the land at the time of mezzadria. It's an old system of managing, let's say, land, but they were really expert. They were fantastic people. I learned a lot, also to be humble and try to understand, because Mother Nature, is quite complicated to manage. You have to respect, you have to see what happened, you have to adapt yourself every day. You cannot change them. You have not to think you are able to change. You can adjust a little bit, but you cannot change. Luckily, I must say.
Yeah. How many properties do you oversee in total then?
All of them. So I have no idea.
Yeah.
There is a list of property, but year after year, we were able to acquire some property. I must say, sometimes with Piero Antinori, we get in love a little bit too easily. Any time we go and visit place, we have something to, something to learn, and we want to really better understand. This is the reason why quite often we also buy some land when we go visiting some places. Albiera always say, if you go somewhere, please don't buy anymore, because we really, we are easily influenced by the place. So we have, property in Puglia, of course, Umbria, which is an old property, Antinori bought in the 1940. There are the two, let's say, main property, the oldest property, which is Chianti Classico, of course, Tignanello and Bolgheri, but there are also new ones. We have Prunotto in Piedmont, we bought at the beginning of 90s, but then we have Le Mortelle, which is in Maremma, in Tuscany. We have Montalcino, we have Montepulciano, we have Cortona, we have Puglia, Salento, but also Castel del Monte. We have something in Chile, which was really interesting for us, instrumental to understand the variety Carmenere. We were discussing with Antonio recently about Carmenere. We have Le Mortelle, so we learned a lot. But of course, we have California. We have Antica in California, which is a wonderful estate. It's really something, maybe it's my second home after Castello della Sala, of course. And a small property together with our friends of Chateau Saint Michel in Washington State called Solar in Red Mountain. So all these property are really in beautiful places, all of them. They have really a peculiarity in terms of climate or soil or variety. And all of them have been really instrumental for me and for us, for all the company to learn about, from the people that are there, from the variety, from the soil, from, the way of management. There is always, but it's not something that's, sometimes we say that just to say something that everybody like. But in this case, there is always something to learn from everybody. For instance, Antonio is here, and I can say easily. I mean, I learned a lot during our, let's say, visit in the vineyard of Tignanello, talking with Antonio about being precise. And I don't remember Antonio when it was, maybe 7, 8 years ago, something like this.
Yeah.
And you know, for me, it was really a sort of, I don't say revelation, but a way of thinking that I never thought about in a certain sense, or how to be precise, how we can improve our precision, how we can really show better what the soil and the place is able to give to us. We were, I don't say a little bit superficial, but we were not so precise as we have to be. And I think from that, let's say, talking with Antonio, I learned a lot. And now I'm sure I feel that our wines are much better than they used to be, but not in terms of quality, but in terms of being precise, in terms of being, I mean, more close to the place where they are produced.
One thing I want to ask both of you is kind of switch gears to Sangiovese in general, because it's something I really want to discuss. You grow it in a lot of different areas within Tuscany. How does it function differently from, say, Montepulciano to Montalcino? And how have both of you seen it evolve over the last few decades?
Antonio, please. I say something opposite, of course.
The nice little easy question.
Yeah, sorry.
Saturday afternoon. All right. Well, I think that it's not just Sangiovese, but the context is in the 90s and 2000s, there was a desire to plant clones that produced really rich, powerful, dark wines, and to make wines that were powerful, rich, and dark, because that was what was believed to be the style that was commercially successful. And those wines actually can be very delicious, and they can actually age very well. But when you peel away the makeup a little bit, you do lose some of the specificity of place. And today, this is not just, this is not just in Tuscany with Sangiovese, but just in general in the world, there's a desire to sort of understand the essence of each place. I think that the advantage of somebody who does what I do, like a critic, is not so much that I have any insights that are necessarily mine, but I get to see what people are doing all over the world, in Burgundy, in Bordeaux, and in Napa Valley, and Tuscany. And that's something that very few people are able to do, to have a perspective that's like, I mean, Renzo does because he has got these properties all over the world, but there's very few people, I think, who have the opportunity, because it's really an opportunity, it's a privilege to see what is happening in a lot of different places, and to see where the similarities are and where the differences are about how people use barrels, how they use corks, how they farm, et cetera, et cetera. So taking it back to Tuscany and Sangiovese, I think that there's just been this desire to, it's an evolution that you see all over the world, which is a desire to strip away some of the heavy extraction, heavy oak, and to really understand the essence of what is behind each place. And just Chianti Classico, so that's before all the places you talked about, just Chianti Classico to me is a lifetime study, because where they are in the north, in the province of Florence, you generally have more fragrant and more bright acid wines, more lively wines. And then when you go down to the province of Siena, which is 45 minutes away, 45 the way Italians drive, and like an hour the way I drive. It's far, but it's not as far as like going from the left bank of Bordeaux to the right bank of Bordeaux. So it's, 45 minutes. But there you're in the province of Siena. You've got, wineries like Felsina, for example, where you get these richer, almost Brunello style, and you're still in Chianti Classico. So just within Chianti Classico, to me, it's like I could spend my entire life trying to understand the difference between Montevertine and Tignanello and Rancia or Felsina and San Giusto Rentenano and all of these wonderful estates. They're all so different. They all are specializing in either pure Sangiovese or high percentage Sangiovese wines, and they're all so different. And that's before we talk about what kinds of clones are planted in Montalcino, what kinds of clones are planted in Montepulciano. So to me, Sangiovese, it's a wonderful variety because it is one of the few varieties that has the ability to really transmit the essence of place. And there you're talking about Riesling, Chardonnay, Sangiovese, Nebbiolo, Cabernet, maybe Merlot, and the list is pretty small. but Sangiovese is a naturally large producer of yield, so you have to manage that. But to me, it's when I spend time we're just talking about Sangiovese in Tuscany, it's endless. I mean, it's just, but that's what's beautiful about wine, as we've talked about in some of these webinars before. It's a lifetime's work, and you still don't know anything. You still don't know anything, but
Sangiovese, yeah, you are right. It's really an intriguing variety. I think it's very modern as a variety, even if it is quite an old variety. It's very modern in that sense. I fully agree with Antonio. Of course, I mean, we have not to forget that, as Antonio was saying, in the late 90s, our problem was that our wines were a little bit anemic in a world that was looking for black wine, not red wine, black wine. So what we did, as Antonio was saying, we decided to, let's say, to have, denser vineyard, to change clones, using clones that were able to ripe earlier. But at the end of all this discussion, we had the global warming. That really was a disaster because, the global warming really enhanced all this kind of condition. And in a certain sense, create problem in a variety like Sangiovese, especially in some places. So we need to rethink, in my opinion, our way of producing Sangiovese, as in most of the places, Sangiovese tends to ripe too early, tends to be too alcoholic, tends to be too rich, tends to lose, in a certain sense, the essence of Sangiovese. I fully agree with Antonio, with some places in Chianti Classico. We have vineyard in Chianti Classico, we have vineyard in Montalcino, we have vineyard in Montepulciano. It's not a matter of discussing where Sangiovese comes better or worse. It's a matter of style. It's not a matter of quality. People prefer Montalcino, which is sweeter, instead of Chianti Classico, which has more energy, some Chianti Classico, or Montepulciano, which has more tannins. It depends on the single drinker, the single taster. I think Sangiovese in Chianti Classico has an expression with more energy, more vertical, especially Chianti Classico, as Antonio was saying, San Giusto, Tignanello, Montevertine, all these places where you are a little bit higher, with a touch of acidity, with Sangiovese, which is, elegant, refined, with grace, but still vertical. Really a great, in my opinion, Sangiovese, a great place. There are other places where Rancia, for instance, Casanova, Bernardino, that are more close, as Antonio was saying, to Montalcino. You have more clay in the soil. You start to be closer to the ocean. You have completely different conditions in terms of soil and climate. It's a little bit warmer. And so wines tend to be a little bit rich. I'll tell you something which happened to me a few years ago. When we have lunch or dinner with Pier Antinori, he comes always with a bottle of wine that you cannot see. So the discussion, what it is. And, quite often it's a disaster. But sometimes, I don't know why, it's a matter of being lucky. So one day we were in Bulgaria, he arrived with a bottle of wine. It was a Bordeaux-shaped bottle. He put the bottle, and what do you think what it is? And we started, maybe it is, I think it's Sangiovese. Yes, Sangiovese, but Sangiovese is not enough. And what I say, I don't know if it is a Sangiovese coming from Chianti Classico in a warm area, like Felsina, or Montalcino from a cooler area, because they are very similar in a certain sense. It was Felsina, because, it is, I don't say in the middle, it remains Chianti Classico, but there's some touch of stylistical touch, which is similar to Brunello. So, and if you go to Montepulciano, you have tannins, you have wines that are really much more powerful, a little bit more rustic, in my opinion. Also because we study much less in Montepulciano than Montalcino and Chianti Classico. So there is still a lot to do also in Montepulciano, studying rootstock, also clonal selection. I think in some place we have to go back to muscle selection instead of doing the clonal selection. In Tignanello, for instance, we have all muscle selection.
Renzo, do you ever think, I had this conversation when I was in Italy last summer with Paolo De Marchi. Do you ever think that Chianti Classico will ever embrace like a village level and a crew system, or and a crew level, that type of system? Because I hear, obviously everyone's like, well, you have Chianti Classico Gran Reserva, Gran Selezione, and why isn't it that value? Why are some and some aren't?
you know, we have been discussing about this, let's say, possibility since 7 or 8 years inside the Consorzio Chianti Classico, and we will reach final results, I think, in the next life. You know, in Italy, everything is complicated. I think Chianti Classico has many different places with different characteristics, and I'm really totally in favor of doing something like this, because you cannot compare a Chianti Classico coming from Lamole with a Chianti Classico coming from Castelnuovo Belardegna. Of course, it is Sangiovese, but they are so different that you have to explain why. So if in the label you can say why, because one is from Lamole, the other one from Castelnuovo, I think it's not negative. But, you know, it's very complicated because people want to do with Gran Selezione, some other with Gran Selezione Riserva, some other with Gran Selezione Riserva and the regular vintage, some other. You know, it's complicated. But I really am completely in favor of doing this. Not too many, at least at the beginning, otherwise we confuse consumers. But I'm really in favor to have, you know, Panzano different than Greve. It makes sense. I don't know, Antonio, what do you think?
Yeah, because right now Panzano, which is where Fontodi is, and La Massa and Rampolla, that is part of administratively of Greve, and the one where Lamole is, and it's a completely different thing. But if you're at the Tignanello estate and you go over just one ridge over to Badia Passignano, which is like a 3-minute car ride or 5, the wines are completely different. Like completely different. So yeah, I mean, it's a whole universe to explore. And I think the more wines are specific, the better, because we live in a world of homogenization. Everything else, it moves towards convergence. The same Starbucks coffee, the same iPhones, and the more in wine, as I've said before on these shows, wine is one of the few things that's made by nature, made by people. And I think it's really important to say this is you know, this is a wine from this village. I mean, the challenge is that some of these areas are quite big. So a place like Gaiole has high altitude places like where Castello di Ama is. It has lower places like San Giusto, and even Gaiole probably needs to be divided into a couple of different subdivisions. But I think that creates excitement. It creates the desire for people to want to have comparative tastings. It creates more information. And, you know, I had on a similar path, I had a similar discussion like this with Krug many years ago, where I told them I wouldn't review their non-vintage Grand Cuvée because you couldn't tell the difference between this year's release and that year's release, and the release in 5 years. They're all the same, like, you know, like a soft drink. And they said, no, consumers can't understand that. It's too complicated. You know, we have to have MV, you know, multi-vintage. Then a couple of years later, they came out with these numbers. They're like 164th edition, 165th edition, et cetera, et cetera. And so what happens? Now people want to taste. Now you see retailers offering the mixed, like I told Olivier, people will want to offer a mixed case of these. No. Consumers don't understand. Now what happens? Retailers offer the mixed case of the various editions of Krug. And consumers, what do consumers want to do? They want to taste the different editions to see, are they different? Are they the same? And anything that creates interest in the consumer, to me, is a positive. So imagine if one day, hopefully not in our next lifetime, but although I'm planning to live a very long time, knock on. So I'm hoping.
I'm much older than you. You know.
No, you're not that much. Anyway, imagine if you had these Chianti Classicos from different areas, and you could taste a Chianti Classico from Panzano, a Chianti Classico from Greve, a Chianti Classico from these various different areas, maybe Ama, Gaiole Alta, Gaiole Bassa, or whatever. That just creates it just creates reasons for people to do tastings, to have seminars, to do events. I mean, it just opens the door to all sorts of initiatives which have an educational bent, but they translate at the end of the day to commerce, and everybody here makes their living selling wine. I mean, let's just distill it to the purest thing. So the more interest that there is, I think that everybody's a winner when you have more things to talk about. And yes, it's going to be imperfect, but life's not perfect. But it's better to be imperfect and do something than to be static and do nothing, in my view. So
I fully agree. And this is the reason why we decided also a few years ago to buy different estate in Chianti Classico, because we wanted to do something like this in order to really to promote properly Chianti Classico, to promote the area, to really reach everybody try to teach everybody how interesting Chianti Classico is, it's important to have different wines coming from different regions, and they are completely different for the reason you say, Antonio, because Sangiovese is very sensitive. Sangiovese is very sensitive to small variation, like a Pinot Noir. It is the same. As you say, you use the same barrel, use the same tanks, use the same approach, the same clones. The only real difference is the place, which means soil and climate.
How have you seen the Gran Selezione start to make an impact, and why is there still such few amount of producers making it?
Di Gran Selezione? You said the Gran Selezione, Sheila?
I did.
No, yeah. Gran Selezione, there are not so many producers because, maybe the concept was not strong enough. The Gran Selezione is practically a Chianti Classico produced and bottled by the same estate. It's not really a selezione. It's integrally produced. This is the reason why we are moving a little bit. We try to move the Gran Selezione in a direction where Gran Selezione should be at least based on 100% Sangiovese or 90% Sangiovese, but without international varieties. I think this is something that could help a lot in encourage more producers to do Gran Selezione and to make Gran Selezione a little bit more, let's say, even more similar. Because in a variety like Sangiovese, also the addition of 20% of Cabernet, or even worse, 20% of Petit Verdot, changes radically the wine. So we need to, if you want to really have a Gran Selezione and try to really teach people about Sangiovese, we need to stay, in my opinion, close to 100% Sangiovese, or at least not use international variety.
Yeah, because the biggest challenge for Chianti Classico is that all of the best wines, or almost all of the best wines, are made outside of the appellation. Okay, so Adam, you mentioned Isola Olena. I mean, he makes a Gran Selezione every couple of years. It's fantastic, but it's not the flagship wine. The flagship wine is Ceparello there. And exactly. The flagship wine of Fontodi is Flaccinello, EGT, yes. Or I think it's EGP now. Yes. And so on and so forth. Montevertine has been out of the appellation forever with Pergole Torte, Percarlo for San Giusto. So the challenge and those wines have a lot of fans all over the world, and they also command a price point that is well above the Chianti Classico, even where the Gran Selezione is settled. So the challenge for these guys is to figure out how do you get what is the framework that you have to create to incentivize those people, if they ever will, to put their top wines into Chianti Classico appellation? Because Tignanello could be Chianti Classico or very close. It could be a Selezione. So the question, because it's also Renzo with this wine. So that's the challenge. And it's not an easy thing to solve, because these estates have these very high profile wines with certain image and prestige, and the Chianti Classico appellation doesn't always fit in with that perfectly, So this might be a next lifetime problem. The other one I'm more optimistic on. This is a big challenge. How do you get Percarlo, to enter the denomination, and does that diminish the wine? I mean, I don't know. It's a great question, but those producers who worked very hard, because there was a time when the pure Sangiovese was looked upon very poorly at the beginning. And now you know what's going to happen because of climate change. Pretty soon, the next thing that gets added to these wines is not an international red grape. It's the ability to add white grapes.
Oh, no. I mean, it is something we have to consider. Probably with Sangiovese, I'm not sure, but there is a reason why. I mean, why the old formula of Chianti Classico was also the white grapes. Yeah. Because one of the problems of the Chianti Classico, one of the problems of Sangiovese has been always tannins and acidity, and especially tannins. A lot of tannins, because the grapes were not ripe. There was an overproduction of grapes, and so wines were light and tannic. And the use of white without tannins was instrumental to allow people to drink the wine easily. I fully agree with you. But look what happened in Côte d'Ivoire.
There was one, I wanted to ask you one thing just on that note, because I was looking in the question, someone had asked, are you considering phasing out Bordeaux grapes from wines like Tignanello, considering that indigenous varieties can do just as well for the typicity of the blend?
Tignanello was born as a wine using red grapes. It was not, I mean, the first vintage of 71, it was not Cabernet. We started adding Cabernet in 75. That was the second vintage, and now Tignanello has this style. I don't think we are going to change it.
Yeah.
So Tignanello will remain Tignanello. I don't think Tignanello could be also Chianti Classico, because for the reason I said before, even if by law we can be Chianti Classico, as we have 80% Sangiovese and 20% Cabernet and Cabernet Franc, we stay inside the Chianti Classico rule. But I think Tignanello stylistically is not Chianti Classico. So if we remove the Cabernet and we use, let's say, Canaiolo instead of Ciliagiolo, instead of Mammolo, we are going to produce another wine, which is not Tignanello.
So Renzo, I get to hear this story multiple times, and whenever I have, Alessandro Leone, who comes to town all the time, and as well as you, I get to hear the story of Tignanello. Number one is, when I was visiting last year, I got a couple strikes because I always refer to Tignanello with a G, which you're not supposed to pronounce. And I go to Alessandro, Tig, and I struck out when I walked in the door. But I'm sitting here, I'm tasting a half bottle each of 15 and 16, enjoying it. I'll enjoy it with my wife a little later. But tell us a little bit about the background and the story of Tignanello. And then I'm sure some people here are tasting some of the vintages like myself. So maybe we could touch on 14 through 18, if you don't mind.
Yeah, allora, Tignanello, I mean, to make the long story short, the first vintage was 71. Actually, we started with a Chianti Classico 1970, coming from the Potere Tignanello. That was the first idea of making something different. We were in a period that was very complicated.
No.
What happened?
No way.
Oops. The Chianti Classico was not successful at that time. We were passing from Mezzadria to manage directly the Vigna, and Piero Antinori was a little bit concerned about the future. And Piero Antinori has been always an innovator. Even now he's 81, but he's still a very strong innovator. I mean, they want to try, want to think, he push everybody to do something different. And at that time, we were at the end of 60s. To be innovator was also the only possibility of trying to survive. And he had the idea of Tignanello. The initial idea was to produce a Chianti Classico coming from Potere Tignanello, but then he realized that, to use also other varieties like white grapes to produce a great red wine was impossible. And so it started with 71 to use just red grapes. Of course, using red grapes at that time were against the law, against the rule of Chianti Classico, and we were obliged to call Tignanello Vino da Tavola. That was the last classification. But I was young at that time, but looking to the numbers recently, I discovered that we used to sell Tignanello at a price that was 3 times the price of Chianti Classico, which in a few words were $1.50 per bottle. That was in 75. In 75, we decided to add a little bit of Cabernet because Sangiovese at that time was a little bit, not rich enough in a certain sense. Even if testing now, also 71, we did also with Antonio, I think we did once. 71 is still very good and was not without Cabernet. So in any case, maybe it was the most easy way of improving the quality to use 20% of Cabernet. We did, and since 75, let's say the formula remained always the same. Tignanello was recognized as a super Tuscan. I think there are many super Tuscan, but I feel, my personal opinion, that a super Tuscan must be based on Sangiovese. This is the real super Tuscan, because Sangiovese is the variety we have in Tuscany. In any case, and we continue to produce Tignanello since now, and it's a very successful wine. We were we pay always a lot of attention not to to have a price also on Tignanello that make the Tignanello a wine that you can open and drink. It's quite affordable as a wine, even if it has a strong image and has a strong quality. I mean, we tasted together with Antonio the 2016 that we have now is really a great vintage. But of course, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18, they are completely different. I mean, 14 as a vintage was a vintage quite complicated. As I said before, we didn't produce any wine 100% Sangiovese except Brunello, where the climate is much better, it's much warmer than Chianti Classico and Montepulciano. So in 14, we were obliged to use a little bit more Cabernet to, let's say, to feel the body of Tignanello a little bit more. And 15, we use less Cabernet. We had 15% Cabernet instead of 20, because Sangiovese was so rich, so strong, so, I mean, beautiful, so ripe. That was really, the use of Cabernet was just because we wanted to maintain the style of Tignanello. 16, in my opinion, is one of the best vintage ever made at Tignanello, because I think 16 has together the essence of the place, but also the energy, the finesse, the grace that Tignanello must have. And 16 was a perfect vintage. Maybe a little bit cooler, not maybe, a little bit cooler than 15, but in terms of being refined, I think 16 Tignanello, in my opinion, stylistically speaking, is the Tignanello I am really close to, because it represents really the style of Tignanello I love. 17 as a vintage was much warmer and most of all much drier. So we have some touch of black fruit instead of red fruit. I don't say the grapes were overripe, but for sure the taste is a little bit more dark. And 18, in a certain sense, is similar to 16, maybe similar to 13 as a vintage. It's very elegant. I think, Antonio, we tasted together the 18, if I'm not wrong. Yeah. I mean, it was from Barons, but I don't know what you think about the description I did of the 4 vintages.
I think it's great that there's, again, it's just the same thing. It's the idea that there's diversity, and that blend changes a little bit, and that you could have 4 vintages that are different. Thank God, because if they were the same, it'd be so boring. So, I mean, I love that. I think it's one of the things that's great about wine is that the wine is a reflection of a year and the growing season and the estate, and then how it gets interpreted. When I taste 16, it's a very Sangiovese driven style of Tignanello. And, I find it very appealing. It's a little closed right now, but I think one of the issues with pure Sangiovese wines is that they have more it's like Pinot Noir in the bottle, there's in this phase where the wine is not young because it's been bottled for a few years, but it's not old either. The wine responds very much to the atmospheric pressure, the day, the whatever. And so it's a little bit more mysterious, but that's, like Pinot Noir can be like that. But
it's the beauty.
I think it's, we have too many things in life that are standardized. So this is one of the few things in life that is not standardized.
1990 was your first vintage with Solaia, correct?
Yes.
And
I mean, I put together, I follow a little bit the vintage, but I put together the wines for the first time. I was lucky. 90 was a good vintage.
Do you mind just explaining a little bit, obviously from the one estate, how Tignanello and Solaia function differently and what people can expect from the 2 different wines?
Practically we are more or less in the same place. There is a different exposure in a certain sense. There is also a different slope. Solaia is a little bit more, more slope, more steeper. And different exposure, which is important, but also different varieties, because we are talking Solaia, we are talking about 80% Cabernet, of which 5, 6, 7% is Franc and 20% Sangiovese. So there are 2 wines that are completely different. One is based on Sangiovese, the other one is based on Cabernet. What they have similar, in my opinion, is the energy, the fact that they are coming from the same place, more or less, from the same hill, and they have the energy of the place. They have the soul of the place. I mean, tasting this wine, even by the nose, you recognize immediately wine coming from Tignanello and Solaia from other wine coming from Badia Passignano or places that are very close, because they have the intensity, they have the verticality, they have the pungency, which is really unique. And I think Solaia, in my opinion, I really think Solaia, we were able to improve the quality year after year. As I said before, Antonio, maybe he doesn't know that, even if I told him, was really important for me in trying to improve the quality. And I can say also why, because we were working in the vineyard of Tignanello, if I remember well. It was summer, and first of all, it was very warm, but not inside the vineyard. There was a little bit of wind, a little bit of breeze. That was fantastic. So I asked Antonio a question that was a little bit, let's say between friends in a certain sense. I say, Antonio, when you taste Italian wines, I think you started from 0 to 98. When you taste French wine, you start from 0 to 100. And he say, no. He say, of course, he couldn't say something different. But then he say something that I think he was right. He said, I think French, sometimes California, they pay much more attention to any detail. And, I say no, of course, I couldn't say it differently, but I must say he was right. And what really helped us to improve the quality of Solaia, but also Tignanello in the last, let's say, 5 or 6, 7 years, was this conversation we had together inside the Tignanello vineyard. Precise means to really pay attention to each details in order to allow the grapes to express themselves, to express the place, to express their identity. And to work on details is not easy, because sometimes, you don't have the feeling, you don't have the perception, you don't have the precision in your mouth. You are not looking for. You say, French oak. One French oak is the same of another. No, they are completely different. They are not completely different because the place. They are completely different because they produce. The coopers. They are completely different because year after year they are different. Because wood is different. There is no way. How to manage the wine, how to process the grapes, how to clean the grapes, how to pick the grapes, when to pick the grapes. There are many variables. And we started to be much more precise, in my opinion. We pay a lot of attention. We always paid, but starting from this discussion, I realized that there was something still to improve. And I think there is always something to improve. And the more you are inside the discussion, inside what you are doing, and the more you realize that you don't know enough. That was, what changed, in my opinion, the continuity, the consistency of the quality of Solaia in the last few years.
So just to wrap that up, what Renzo's talking about is a discussion about cooperage and barrels. And again, this is something that happens when you have the chance to see what other people do in other parts of the world. It's not like some sort of divine, inspiration from up high or anything. And this is not limited to Antenori or Tignanello as a wine or Solaia, but it's the reality that, especially in the 80s and 90s, I think, the kinds of barrels that were arriving in Italy were not the top choice. They were the top choice of what was being offered in Italy, but comparing a top of the line barrel that arrived in Piedmont or Tuscany, it was a different quality barrel than the kind of barrel that arrived in Pauillac or Beaune. And this is what I shared in that conversation, was my belief that a lot of Italian wines in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s were penalized by substandard oak and substandard cork. And that just comes from tasting of a lot of wines in different places and sort of comparing, for example, the percentage of corked wines in Burgundy versus the percentage of corked wines in Piedmont or Tuscany, and asking, why is it that I almost never encounter a corked bottle in this region? And why is it that the percentage of corked wines is much higher over here? And as you think about things for years and you talk to people for like a lot of months out of every year, then you start to put together the pieces of this puzzle. And that was just my belief, but it's not really limited to this estate or these wines. That's one thing. The second thing that Renzo left out, which I think is very amusing about Solaia, because many Italian wines are like this from Tuscany, is that first vintage was made from Cabernet that was too much to go into Solaia. It was a large crop that year, and they had too much Cabernet because the Tignanello is mostly a Sangiovese wine. So at the end of the blending or the end of the harvest, they realized they had too much Cabernet, and that Cabernet became a new wine, sort of an accidental wine. And the reason I think that that's amusing is that you find other instances of that in Tuscany with things like the Merlot at San Giusto Rentenano was initially cultivated to be a blender. Then they realized it was better on its own. The Merlot at Ornellaia was an experimental wine that now is sold in the Place de Bordeaux at, I don't know, 700-800 euros a bottle. The Sassicaia was the family's home wine, never meant to be consumed, and now it's an iconic wine. And I just think it's amusing that a lot of wines that were created in this sort of between the 70s and the 90s in Tuscany, they were just, you know, the product of chance. They weren't the product of some grand design. It just, you know, things came together, and now we have these wonderful wines that are, they weren't meant to be, and they're wonderful. All those 4 wines that I mentioned were not created to become what they are today.
Yeah, but to reinforce what you say, Antonio, I have a couple of examples that really are precisely what you say. Most of the corks used in Burgundy in the first, let's say, Grand Cru are produced by Trescas, the local producer. We have been using Trescas, I think, since beginning of 90s in our Cervaro della Sala, because the guy of Jadot told us to use this cork during one visit at the beginning of 90s, something like this. But recently I had the occasion to talk with the people at Trescas. I say, you know, when I open bottle of Burgundy, I really always, I see the corks that are better than mine. Why? I ask, I mean, the best cork you have, why you don't give us? They say, you know, because usually Italian, they don't want to pay. No? And I say, you know, I didn't ask you the cost. I asked you to have the best cork. And they say, yeah, you know, we don't give to Italians because usually they don't want to pay. But now, I mean, we became good friends. And now, I mean, we have also this cork. The same with the barrels. I cannot say the name of the cooperage, but it's very important, maybe one of the most important in the world. He came to me during our, let's say, time spent in Chernobyl, Antonio.
Yeah.
He came to me and said, Renzo, why you don't buy my barrels? After the discussion I did with you, I say, I don't buy your barrels because I'm convinced you don't give me the best barrels you have. And he say, no. You know, you say no. I say, yes, I don't buy, and you are happy, I'm happy. After a couple of days, he called me and he said, Renzo, we need to talk. And now this cooperage is one of the first in terms of supplying cooperage of Antinori. So I really believe, as you say, there is a lot to do, a lot to understand, a lot to improve. Of course, I'm convinced that the secret is in the vineyard, the secret is the grapes, but grapes are not enough. I mean, everybody says to produce a great wine, you need great grapes, of course. But then you have to manage the grapes properly, and you manage grapes in the winery.
So Renzo, and I know Antonio, I could touch on you for this as well, but I'd like to hop to Renzo again. And this was a question asked by Scott Bryant in this. I'm going to ask his question. I'm also going to expand on it. When you taste from barrel, what do you have to consider / think about to imagine what the wine will taste like after bottling? Is there very much difference at the barrel stage from the bottling stage? And I guess my further question to that is, I understand that you and Piero do the final blends of the wines. And when do you guys decide that that's the bottling? When's that trigger point for you guys? And is it much different from the barrel taste that you've had to the bottle?
But you know, it is a matter of experience in a certain sense, because year after year, you really acquire the experience to understand what could be the passage between the barrels to the bottle. So it is difficult to explain how you do this, because it's a matter of, I mean, you do something automatically in a certain sense. But of course, when you test barrel by barrels, as it happened in Solaia, as it happened in Tignanello, Cervaro, in most of our wine, Guadaltasso, also in Aglianico, I mean, Bocca di Lupo, it's an Aglianico we produce in Puglia. We test barrels by barrels, and you have some barrels that are not even the same cooperage, even with the same toasting, even the same wood, that are different than the other. And you need to understand if these barrels can be in the blend or not. And sometimes we prefer to manage separately. We prefer not to put in the blend because, once you put in the blend, you cannot remove. So you have to rack the wine and see after racking, because sometimes after racking, wine is completely different than the taste you have from the barrels, because they take oxygen and they breathe a little bit and they change completely. So you have to be careful. It is much better to have more lot in order to taste later and decide if you want to blend or not. Sometimes even if you have a little bit of tannins in the barrels, could be instrumental because the other baby, they need it. So I think it's important to really have different load and pay attention to each detail. But of course, it's a matter of experience, it's a matter of sensitivity, it's a matter of what is your level? What is the level you want to reach? You want to make a 100-point wine. I mean, let's talk about points. 100-point wine, 98, 97, 95, where you want to stay. And you have to adapt your mount and based on the final result. Of course, as I said, it's a matter of sensitivity. It is not something you can learn from the school, but you need time. You need really to pay attention to each detail also when you taste. And I think sometimes, for instance, I love Pinot Noir, but also because I think Pinot Noir is a variety that can teach a lot in terms of understanding nuances. Also whites. I mean, I think one of the best experience a winemaker can do in making red wine is to taste champagne. Because champagne, they are so precise, so, complex and simple, that really, once you really are able to understand each single nuance in a champagne, you really can say that your palate is professional. I don't know, Antonio, what do you think about that?
Well, I'll answer the first part first. So champagne is obviously hard to taste because you have the carbonation and the sugar. And so, yeah, you have to be able to get through that and then be able to focus on the wine. Tasting Vin Clair is very hard because the acidity is very high. But I do think Burgundy is the best school because, as we've talked about before, there's, basically those are single variety wines and, you're just tasting the place. In terms of what you taste in barrel, I think it depends a lot whether it's early in the aging or at the end. Most of the times when I'm at Tignanello, we're tasting the wines right before they're going to be bottled, like a month or two before. So the wine is basically formed. It's, it's like 95% there, but you're looking at a canvas that's unfinished, a sculpture that's started. You're tasting a dish from a chef that's not ready to be plated yet. So you have to have some frame of reference with past vintages, sort of understand where it fits in. You have to have an understanding of the vintage across many properties. If I taste 18 at Tignanello, I'm comparing it to all the other 18s that I've tasted, so to have context, and I'm comparing it to all the other vintages of Tignanello that I've tasted before, and trying to get a sense of how this wine represents the year. And if it's pretty close to bottling, I think you get a 95% accurate view of the wine. If you're tasting at the beginning of élevage or like 6 months in, like you do in Bordeaux, that's more art and sciences, but there's a lot of art and it's a lot of imagination because there it's, it's sort of like you're looking at a child and trying to figure out what they're going to look like as an adult. I mean, it's, you could be right on the money. You could be also really far off. So tasting wines young, obviously there's just much less certainty. But when we taste these wines, they're very close to bottling. And so it's pretty easy to have you're getting a pretty complete view of what the wine is. And the other thing about Tignanello is that now at the beginning you aged, you aged the wine together. Then you went through a period where you aged all the components separately. And now you're back to a philosophy where you're aging the wine together. So there's been kind of this arc. And so when you are tasting a wine that's sort of aged together at the end, it is really pretty done. Whereas there are parts of the world where the blending is very late. Napa Valley is a very good example. And when you taste the wine from the barrel before bottling, you've tasted a wine that's only been assembled, relatively recently. It's not hasn't spent its whole life aging together. So these are some of the things, because the question is sort of how do you know what to look for? You have to sort of understand the philosophy of each estate and each region and sort of really understand, what am I tasting here? Am I tasting a wine that's 2 months from bottling, but that has aged its whole life together? Or am I tasting a wine that was assembled in a lab like 3 weeks ago? Because that's a big difference, you know, and at this level, making wine, it's like Formula One racing, you know, like the smallest difference is the hugest difference.
That's great. That's a great
It may seem like it's minimal, like the pressure of the tires or whatever. It may seem like, well, how can that really matter? But at this level, the smallest thing is the biggest thing. And if you then have several small things, that's the difference between, like, I don't want to say crashing, but it's a difference between like a really great wine and a good wine. And not that there's anything wrong with good, but
Ferrari and Haas.
Yeah.
Nothing to add. No, sometimes I try to correct Antonio, but in this case, I mean, I fully agree.
Having a good day, I guess.
So I really want to jump into about the wines that some of us have in our glasses, but before I get to that, it's a question for both of you. I know a lot of my friends, especially big wine collectors, are obsessed with the biodynamic calendar. Not to say Tignanello isn't great every day, but obviously today is a fruit day, and this was a question asked by Sid Cross. Do you feel that when you taste wines that this is an important thing for you? Do you, if it's a root day or a fruit day, if it's a root day, do you consider that in your tasting, or do you not even look at that or care about that? And Antonio, I'd love to hear also what you think about.
You know, I never pay attention to this, but there are for sure some days that where it is much more difficult to really understand deeply the wine you taste. And it happened to me sometimes, not often, luckily, doing my job it is a problem. But there are some days where you have immediately the perception of what you have been tasting. And there are some other that you need much more concentration and makes the tasting much more complicated. I must say, my life, maybe few times, but it happened to me. After 3 or 4 glasses, I decided not to go ahead because I was not able to be, I say, concentrated enough to understand all the nuances in the glass. So it could happen. I don't know why. I mean, maybe because they're biodynamic.
Antonio, what do you think?
I think that the concept of biodynamics is very deeply entrenched in some regions. Burgundy is one of them. I remember once a very famous producer you know, when somebody forwards you an email that they didn't mean to copy you on, and I was trying to make this appointment at this estate, very famous producer, you know, and they responded, they accidentally copied me on the response to their importer, who says, I don't ever allow critics to taste my wines without if it's not a fruit day, and it was like all in caps. This guy was really pissed off. So in Burgundy, this concept is very entrenched. In Bordeaux and in parts of Italy, much less so. But I remember having this conversation with Alfred Tesseron at Ponte Canet. I was sort of surprised that we were tasting on a root day, and he said, my wine has to, and he's a fervent biodynamic, one of the most intense biodynamic people in Bordeaux. And it's not just biodynamics, but it's also working the vineyard with the horse, and it's the whole deal. No electricity, no manual anything. I mean, no mechanical anything. He said, you know what? My wine's got to be good every day. When people buy it, they open it, it's got to be good 365 days a year, which I thought was a very smart answer. But I think more than the biodynamic calendar, there's other 2 things that matter. One is light, and the other is pressure. And I think if it's a fruit day and it's cold and raining and cloudy, I would rather have a not fruit day, but it's sunny and the pressure is good pressure for tasting wine. You know, because I think your mood is influenced by light, and like today is a very sunny, bright day, clear sky, and that just puts you in a better mood. And we are humans, and I think more than biodynamics, atmospheric pressure and light have an impact on the psyche and the inside mood that you're in. So yeah. I would much rather have that as a tasting setting than looking at a calendar.
But also, Antonio, I think, I mean, we have to distinguish, in a certain sense, tasting than drinking. Because, you know, I mean, of course, tasting is more something, is an exercise. Drink is a pleasure. So I think you have to drink wine anytime you like, provided it is a pleasure. See,
And
quite often it is a pleasure.
That's the first time I've heard it described like that, and that's amazing. It makes a ton of sense. With that being said, let's jump to what you have in your glass. Bramito, I believe. Do you both?
I have Brunello.
You have Brunello.
Well, let's
But
talk
I have
about-
also other. I mean, let me know what you think I have to open. I have Tignanello. I have, but I have Bramito. It's the first glass. You know, yes, I open with the Bramito.
Let's start because I want to. I find this kind of amazing, and I feel like you'll like this. We got a question that says, "I'm not an expert, so maybe I'm wrong, but the Cervaro reminds me of Burgundy white wine. Can you help me understand during the tasting and the difference between the two?" And I mean, there was influence from Burgundy on the creation of those wines, correct?
Of course. I mean, I started making Cervaro. I mean, releasing Cervaro with the 2000 with the 85 vintage, 1985. But I started to try to make a wine like this with the 81 vintage, because I mean, I had the occasion to taste in 81. It was June, was the second edition of Vinespo in Bordeaux, together with a friend, an American friend, Darrell Corti, coming from Sacramento. We went to a restaurant and he decided to take a bottle of Corton Charlemagne 71. You know, at that time in Italy was 81. To think about a white wine 10 years old was really unthinkable. And now we have internet, we have all the information, we are all, let's say, we know everything. You know, but I mean, 40 years ago, in order to know something about Burgundy, there were two occasions to go there and read some book. Read some book sometimes was mean, in a certain sense, mean to read a book that was written 20 years before. So practically there was no knowledge. And I didn't know at all, in a certain sense, the production of Burgundy. And for me, tasting Corton Charlemagne 71 in 81 was really something, you know, that changed my life, changed my idea of wine. And this is the reason why coming to Castello della Sala, together with the help of Piero Antinori, that really believed a lot in this young boy, we decided to try to produce a wine similar, because in a certain sense, in terms of place, Orvieto remains a place where white wines were produced since the Etruscan era. It has been always a white wine region. It is a region where, I mean, soil is very rich in lime, very high pH. So it's really a great soil for white grapes. In terms of climatic condition, I mean, I think at Castello della Sala, we are really in a wonderful place to do it, and we tried. Of course, for the first vintage, it was a failure. 81, 82, 83, 84 was a disaster. Even 85, we released the 85, but the vintage was so-and-so, and the wine was so-and-so. What really changed our, let's say, production in a certain sense, the quality of this wine, the style of this wine was with the 86, when we realized that, I mean, this wine had to do the malolactic fermentation to become a little bit, let's say, richer and complex. And in order to produce a great wine, we needed to use, let's say, more new oak. Because at the beginning, we thought that to produce a white wine, old oak was better. And that was a big mistake. So starting from 86, I think we have produced a Cervaro, which is similar in a certain sense, because practically it's the same grape. We use a little bit of Grechetto, which is a local variety for technical and philosophical reason. But, you know, practically the wine is 90% Chardonnay, and it is produced in a Burgundy style, in a Burgundy way. I must say that for a certain period, Cervaro, in my opinion, where we went a little bit too further in terms of having a wine more tropical and not enough mineral. But starting from, I mean, the first vintage were more mineral than tropical. Then in the middle of 90 to, let's say, beginning of 2000, the wine was a little bit too heavy. And we changed it again at the end of the first decade of the 2000, tried to make a wine more refined, with more grace, more vertical, a little bit more acidity, with a little bit more acidity, less wood. And I think Cervaro we have now is really, I mean, stylistically speaking, is a great wine. and it is a wine that can age for a long time without any problem. In that sense, it can compete in terms of ageability and in terms of evolution, in my opinion, with Burgundian wines. Of course, there is still a lot to do, a lot to learn, a lot to address, but I think we are on the right way, especially with the last vintages. I must say in 2014 was very good, 15, 16, 17 we have is a vintage a little bit, in my opinion, a little bit too warm for a wine like Cervaro, which is good, but a little bit too rich. But you know, it's a matter of style and not the quality. 18 was very good, and Bramito 18 I think is very good now, because this wine that is produced partially with barrel fermentation wine and partially with stainless steel fermentation. So, and then we blend together, is a good mix in order to make a wine which is enjoyable, but not too complex, and also able to be sold at a price which is quite affordable. And it represents clearly the essence of Castello della Sala.
So when did Bramito start being produced?
I mean, we started producing the Chardonnay in the early 90s, but we called Bramito later. Bramito, you know, Cervaro means, just a few seconds to say the history of the names. Cervaro comes from Monaldeschi della Cervara. Monaldeschi were an old family that used to be the king of Orvieto in a certain sense. And they were divided in 4, let's say, branches. One of those was called Monaldeschi della Cervara. And from Monaldeschi della Cervara, that they were the owner of Castello della Sala, we took the name Cervaro. Cervaro means deer, back. And Bramito is the sound of the deer when is in love. When they do, this is Bramito, we call Bramito. And the name Bramito is, let's say, close to Cervaro for that reason. I don't know if the explanation in English was good, Antonio, was understandable.
I think it was perfect. I can't possibly add to that charming Italian explanation.
And then also in your glass, I believe, Antonio, do you have the 2014 Piano de Vin with you?
Yep.
Well, we have time. I just want to jump to Montalcino as well. So Renzo, is it the 2014 Piano de Vin you have there?
Is this one?
Yeah, can you speak to the 14 and then the 2015 vintage as well? That obviously is getting a lot of attention and coming out.
I mean, 14, there is an English word which is perfect, which means nothing, which is challenging, which means you don't know if it is good or bad, you say challenging. In any case, 14 was challenging. Challenging because, I mean, we had quite a rainy season, quite cool. And this is the reason why I say we didn't produce, for instance, Badia Passignano, or we didn't produce Santa Pia, which is our, let's say, 100% Sangiovese in Montepulciano. We didn't produce our Villa Antinori Chianti Classico in 14. But we produced Brunello, even if we produced 30% less than the regular vintage, because we were obliged to select a lot. Why we decided to produce Brunello? Because we are in a region, in an area of Brunello which is quite warm, and we were able, I don't say to escape the rain, but for sure to manage much better the season as we are in a warm climate. And this is the reason why sometimes in a warm, let's say, season, we have some difficulties and we have to adjust our viticulture accordingly. So we selected a lot, but I think we always, in our Brunello, we always prefer to make a wine with a nice drinkability. We are still working on Brunello in terms of style, because we were obliged to remove the old vineyard that were bad, to replant all the vineyard. And you know, the new vines, in a certain sense, are like young people, let's say, which is not negative, it's positive. So, I mean, young people, they said they react. Immediately, they have a reaction, they are a little bit hysteric. And so they are not able to manage, you know, to manage the season, because the roots are superficial, because the body, which means the trunk, is a little bit too small. And so they are very reactive to, to the seasonal weather. And this is the reason why we were not able for a few years to really establish a style of Pian delle Vigne. I think with 14, even if the vintage was not really a great vintage, we were able to produce really an very drinkable wine, very precise, wonderful tannins, not green, that in a vintage like this was really, a success. Of course, 14 is not a vintage you can age forever. It is not like 15, that was a great vintage. But in any case, it's really a fantastic wine to drink, very enjoyable, very pleasant as a wine. So it represents Brunello in a vintage which was challenging, but not bad.
Sheila, so Montalcino is another area that's huge. You can have a difference of a month time harvest from the northern part. So most people would arrive to Montalcino from Chianti Classico or Siena. And when you do that, the first part that you get to is the northern part of Montalcino, which is cooler, and a lot of the vineyards are higher in altitude. Then you get to the town of Montalcino, and then you can go down the other side of the hill to get down to where Pian delle Vigne is and a lot of other estates. The difference in harvest just in Montalcino can be 30 days between the northern part and the southern part. And naturally, the southern part is warmer. You're getting close to Grosseto, Maremma. And so in a colder year, the naturally warmer places like this are favored, where the cooler places in a cold vintage are really, SOL. But in the southern part, to use an American or English expression, Renzo, but I'll tell you off camera, but in a colder year, you want to be in the warmer areas. So that's why that wine turned out the way it is.
Exactly.
And Renzo, sorry, I'm hiding behind this picture here. What do one thing, I love Pian della Vigna. It's one wine that I tend to go to very often, whether it's with friends, family, or what have you. What's your advice on the aging potential of 2014? Is this something that you suggest that people are going to be drinking on the younger side, or what's your opinion on that, and Antonio too?
Generally speaking, I don't think the 14 is a vintage you can age long. For sure, 10 years is not a problem. But I mean, there are some vintage like 15 that they have really the structure, body, the tannins that allow the wine to age more and better. So I think 14 remains a vintage, which is, as I said before, really enjoyable, but for sure not a vintage that you can age for many years. Maybe 10, maybe 15. Nobody knows, because we say, drink after 5 years, after 10 years. Nobody knows. The reality is nobody knows how the wine is able to evolve. There are vintages you think they evolve perfectly in 20 years, then after 10 years they start to be old, and there are other you think they are light and they are perfect after 20 years. It's very complicated. We tasted our Solaia together, Antonio, in London, and even vintages that were lighter, they evolved beautifully. So it's difficult to say. Knowing the vintage, I would suggest to age no more than 10, 15 years, knowing the vintage. But maybe I'm wrong.
Because wines age on balance. They don't, so the balance of the wine is not how rich it is or how powerful it is. It's kind of the wholeness of it. And yeah, sometimes the wines, especially from colder vintages, they actually age really well. But there is a lack of structure here for Montalcino, and I wouldn't push it myself beyond 15 or so years. But there's plenty of cases where wines from cold vintages surprise you down the line, and they can acquire body in the bottle. A lot of mysterious things can happen. But yeah, that's my sense. That's what I would suggest also. I agree with you, Renzo. It's more like a 10 to 15 year proposition. 14 is unusually, it's not, you have great vintages and then you have good vintages and then you have kind of average. And 14 is like really, Renzo says challenging, but we're talking like really challenging, cold, wet, rainy. Like you just don't see the last vintage that was 2002. So you're talking about over a decade to find something similar. So we're talking like, it's really an outlier. It's not that it's not great. It's really like, far out.
So I would be remiss not to mention the 14 is available here in Ontario. We are rolling into 15 in the coming months, along with the rest of the world. So wherever you are, stay tuned for that 15 vintage that is coming. We are releasing 2018 Bramito, but I was just asked a great question. And Renzo, I feel like you're going to eat this one up. Antenori looking forward, tradition versus innovation. How can you understand that, with all how viticulture is changing, with the new technology and etc., yet you have a tradition. How do you guys balance that? What do you see with that?
As I said before, tradition is a background and knowledge that should help us to innovate. This is my opinion. So we need to innovate, and we need to innovate also because the weather, oblige us to be innovative. We are facing this global warming. If we think how we planted our vineyard 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we planted our vineyard, as we said before, in order to have grapes that were able to ripe before the fall, before the rain. And now they become ripe too early. And quite often they are not really in balance. And so we need to rethink our viticulture. We need to rethink our drying system. We need to rethink our, let's say, density, because we have not to forget, to have more density means to have more competition in water. In most of our appellation, we cannot irrigate, and we don't have water to irrigate. So how we can stay in a global warming, how we can, let's say, manage a vineyard in a global warming if it is too dense. They go every year under stress. And grapes, vines, like people, they don't produce well under stress. They have to be close to be stressed, but not stressed. And so, and I think we need to rethink our way of planting vineyard, having maybe less density, maybe having the higher drying system in order to allow the ventilation moving below the clusters, in order to avoid to have, heat from the soil during the night if the cluster are too close to the soil. So we need to rethink a little bit. We need to rethink orientation. We need to rethink rootstock. We need to rethink selection. We need to go back in the past in a little bit. We need to to have a viticulture which is in line with the weather condition, with the condition we have now. That is, something we will be obliged to do. There is nothing to do, and I think this is something which is really fascinating in a certain sense, because this obliges you to think always how you can improve, how you can adapt. And I love this job for that reason, because it is not boring. This is the great, let's say, advantage of this job. After 40 years, I'm not really tired to do something I'm doing since 79, but I know that next year I will do something different than this year. And that helps a lot to maintain, not just myself, the wine sector alive, provide that really we have clear that we need to adapt anything we do with different weather, different taste. If we think about 20 years ago, Antonio was talking about the taste, about the perception, about the style that now people are looking for. 30 years ago, we wanted to produce Australian wines. Now we want to produce Burgundian wines. This is the reality. And people want to drink wines that have the intensity, but they have to be light. Intense, but light. 30 years ago, they want to drink wine heavy, independently if they have a nose better than other. We wanted to drink black wine. Now we want to drink red wine. This is the reality, and we have to adapt. We have to, because we produce wine for us, but also for people that buy the wines, not just for us. I drink a lot, but not enough.
One thing, just before we wrap up, one thing I did want to ask you about too is bottle aging in the cellar. One of the big things I was curious about is we just received an amazing offer of back vintage and large format wines from you. Is there a certain percentage that you try to library every year? And what are your thoughts on that, and how you release wines, and at what point when you release back vintage, is the point largely to have customers open them in the short term, or to age them as well beyond that?
No, they can age. We were in Italy, and of course Antinori, we were not accustomed to keep the wine, to have a library. I remember, especially in the first time of my career, we didn't use to keep the wine in our library, just a few, let's say a few hundred bottles, 200, 300, 400 bottles, just for us to see, the evolution. But it was not the idea of releasing all vintages. We started to think about this when Solaia 97 was named by Wine Spectator the Wine of the Year. So it means in 2001, in 2000. So we started from 97 to think about the possibility to keep some quantity, let's say, in our cellar. And now we have some, few bottles of different vintages that I think they are really helpful to really understand the wine. Because, when you do a vertical tasting, when you taste an old vintage, you have the possibility of really understand the soul of the wine. I hate having a vertical tasting when people say, I prefer this, I prefer that. A vertical tasting is a unique occasion to really understand the wine, to really understand where you are, to really understand what are you drinking, to really understand the soul of the wine. And to have the possibility for us to release all vintage will help a lot, and is helping a lot people, wine lovers, to really understand the soul of our wines. So we are going to do also in the future more and more for that reason.
Well,
I don't know what you think, Antonio, about that, but it's the only way.
I think it's great. I think the lack of library programs has been one of the biggest, one of the biggest weak spots of wineries in Italy, the lack of that, because it means that you don't have a culture of aging your own wine, because you would only do that if you were either financially strapped or you didn't believe in the wine yourself. And so when wineries start to have libraries, it's a big step up, because so many, I know you guys we're sort of at our limit, but the number of elite estates in Italy that have no library would blow you away. It's really common. Now less so, and I think it's great because it shows sort of moving into the next sort of generation of maturity, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, as I want to wrap up here, I first want to mention, Antonio, do you want to briefly tell us about Delectable? Because I always say this on our webinars, I am an avid user, and I suggest other people do use it as well. But what is Delectable?
So Delectable is a sort of like an Instagram of wine. You take a picture of a wine, then you can save it in your profile, write your review of it for your own for your own self, to be able to recall the wine that you had on the 11th of April at lunchtime. What was that? Oh, it was Tignanello, or it was Bramito or Cervaro. And then it links to merchants that sell that wine. Right now, that's just in the US, but we'd like to roll that out more globally. But it's basically an Instagram of wine where you can talk to your close friends who have the same interests, and a very large number of professionals, and keep a track record of the wines that you've tasted over the years. It's the only place you can really do that, because there's a lot of other social media apps, but stuff gets lost, and it's really hard to say, oh, I want to search my notes for Tignanello. You can do that on Delectable and pull up, let's say, every vintage you've ever had, for example. And it's really the only app that allows you to do that isn't trying to sell you stuff constantly. Because for us, everything that we do, whether it's Delectable or Vinous or whatever, is all about education and community. And that's kind of what we're aiming to do. We're as a company, we build partnerships. We're not interested in taking away anybody's market share. We're not interested in disrupting anything. We're interested in working with people to grow the pie for everybody. So everything that we do is very positive and focused really on helping people enjoy wine as much as they want to. So
that's great. Yeah. So in terms of Antenori, Tignanello is 2017s are worldwide. The release is at the end of this month. So be sure in your wine shops in the United States, Europe, you name it, make sure to go grab some. I know here in Canada, we're going to be a few weeks behind that. But, if you want to go visit our website, helperwine.com, and visit the Antenori brand page, you're able to see everything that's available right now for purchase, along with some stuff that's coming in, including Tignanello 2017, that you can email us for reservations. After this is all over and you close up your screen, there's a Google form. Feel free to fill it out. We're trying to improve what we're doing here. We believe we are improving after every single one. So any suggestions or comments, we appreciate it. Helpern here in Ontario, we do contactless delivery free in the GTA. So feel free to place orders online and we will make sure we get to them very quickly. We are sorry we couldn't get to all your questions. It's been unbelievable, and it's been a privilege to be able to sit here, Sheila, with you, Renzo, and you, Antonio, to discuss about Antinori and wines in general. I've learned a crazy amount today. I continue to learn, and I'm grateful to have you two and Sheila, of course, with us and joining us. So thank you guys so much for being here today.
Probably
Thank
could
you
have
so
been
much. Thank you so much. Happiest Easter to everybody, to your family. And please drink a good glass of wine and possibly Antinori.
Well, once again, thank you so much. In terms of our next panelists and our next guests, we're going to be announcing that on Monday. We're now moving to Saturdays only, so stay tuned for our next panelist. On Monday, we're going to release it on our social media feeds. You'll see it there. Please, everyone, be safe. Thank you for tuning in. Volume 6, next Saturday at 1 p.m. Eastern. Thank you guys to our panelists again. Be safe, be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you and take care. Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao Antonio. Ciao Sheila. Ciao Adam. Ciao.
Ciao.